Question 3. Are all holy books created equal? For every one of the thousands of religions in existence, we tend to find a corresponding book that's considered sacred. But how exactly did each of these so-called sacred scriptures come about? We have to ask ourselves, which book, if any, can I trust? It's not hard to find a variety of people who each vouch for their preferred holy book. Since they teach fundamentally different things, someone has to be wrong. So, how are these different religious books composed? Did they all come about in the same way? Here's just 4 different tests we can use to determine if a book is reliable. Here are 5 of some of the most widely distributed holy books. Since the teachings of Hinduism don't rule out any possibilities, we're going to focus on books that make specific truth claims about the nature of reality. For the sake of time, we'll look at 4 books, 2 of which have a very similar origin. First up, the Holy Book of Buddhism. Siddhartha Gautama, the original Buddha, vowed not to come back to civilization until he had found the answers within himself to some of life's biggest questions. Alone, sitting under a tree, he came up with what is now known as Buddhism. He gained a following as he taught people how to escape the desires of the world and achieve nirvana. History shows us that it took not 100, not 200, not 300, but about 400 to 500 years after Siddhartha had died for his followers to commit just some of his teachings to writing. Furthermore, it wasn't for another 500 years after this for the first modern version of the Tipitaka to be produced. To complicate the situation even further, there are about 231,000 pages of teachings that are attributed to Siddhartha, almost all of which have yet to be translated into modern languages. In a book endorsed by the Dalai Lama, one author has this to say: "The Buddha did not write down any of his teachings, nor were his teachings recorded in writing by his disciples." Indian culture at the time the Buddha lived was still predominantly pre-literate. The records of his teachings that we have do not come from his own pen or from transcriptions made by those who heard the teachings from him, but from monastic councils held after his parinibna, his passing away. When it comes to internal consistency, it seems unlikely that none of these 231,000 pages contradict what has come before. There's hardly anything in the Buddha's teachings that have to do with history or archaeology, so in that regard, there's not much for us to examine. There's also not many miracle claims in Buddhism. Siddhartha Gautama himself died from something as trivial as food poisoning. So in that regard, there's nothing to attest to Buddhism's credibility. Siddhartha likely had good intentions in the message that he was preaching. However, we have to remember how the religion started. Siddhartha assumed he would find the answers within himself to life's biggest questions. It would seem this is a clear case of confirmation bias. There's no way to ensure that Siddhartha's original words weren't lost over the course of the first 500 years after his life. It's even more unlikely that his words were preserved when modern versions arose nearly 1,000 years after his death. Next, let's take a look at a brief overview of how the Bible came about. The Bible is unique in that it is a collection of books from over 40 authors spanning thousands of years. It claims to describe the actions of one God throughout all of history. Because this book has such a long history, a number of objections tend to arise. Some people say that we can't trust the Old Testament. It's so old that it's probably been changed over the years. Consider the book of Isaiah. As one of the most theologically profound books of the Bible, many people assume it's been altered even more than other parts of the Old Testament. Before just a few decades ago, there was no way to verify the accurate preservation of what Isaiah actually wrote. Then came 1947, just a few miles outside of the city of Jerusalem. Tucked away in a cave, some young boys stumbled across a great collection of ancient scrolls. This is a picture of one of those scrolls that they found. It's a copy of the entire book of Isaiah. Christian and, more importantly, non-Christian scholars agree that the scroll was written about 125 years before the time of Jesus. You can go online right now and take a look at the text for yourself. Let's take a look at the NASB Bible from 1995, the King James Version Bible from nearly 4 centuries ago, and lastly, the Great Isaiah Scroll, showing what it said before the time of Jesus. Take a minute to pause the video and compare the translations. Has the message been lost? At the very least, when it comes to the book of Isaiah, objection number 1 falls apart. Another objection says that the New Testament was changed at the infamous Council of Nicaea. Around the same time, Constantine changed the text to say that Jesus is God. This is Papyrus 66. It is an entire copy of John's eyewitness account of the life of Jesus. Again, take a minute to pause the video and compare the texts. Has the deity of Jesus been inserted into later translations? Or is that what John was recording from the very beginning? Perhaps the most well-known critic of the Bible's reliability is Bart Ehrman. In the appendix of just one edition of his book titled Misquoting Jesus, he has this to say about his mentor who happens to be a Bible-believing Christian. Even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he is a firmly committed Christian and I am not. We are in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. If he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement. Maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. The position I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. He's also admitted that when it comes to the New Testament, we have much earlier attestation than any other book of antiquity. Critics may take portions of the Bible out of context to make them seemingly contradict. An in-depth study of the Bible displays an awe-inspiring degree of consistency throughout its pages, especially when we consider that it contains records of thousands of years of history. Even if you reject the supernatural claims of the Bible, it does provide a remarkably accurate history of the ancient Middle East. Just consider the book of Acts. Colin Hemmer's work has shown that it makes at least 84 specific observations that can be confirmed either by historical sources, archaeological evidence, or both. And that's just one book of the New Testament. When it comes to motivation, it can be hard to make generalizations about every one of the 40-plus writers of the Bible. However, just about all of Jesus' disciples, some of which were New Testament authors, were killed for proclaiming what they believed they had witnessed. Lastly, we've seen the manuscript evidence and heard what the Bible's harshest critics have to say when it comes to preservation. Finally, let's take a look at the Book of Mormon and the Quran. Joseph Smith taught that the Book of Mormon, first written in 1830, was the most correct of any book on earth. Ask yourself, are these changes simple spelling and grammar mistakes, or did the author change his mind? The Quran also came about in a rather unique way. Muhammad is said to have received a message from an angel. He then repeated that message to his followers. Over the course of just a few years, his followers wrote down different versions of what he had said. After Muhammad's death, one of his successors, Uthman, had all these various editions collected and burned. Only the version that he thought was most accurate was preserved. While this doesn't necessarily prove that any of Muhammad's words had been lost, everything rests on Uthman's choice of which text was the best. On the question of motivation and how these books came to be, consider these parallels between Joseph Smith and Muhammad. When it comes to the Quran, there's much debate on what is to be taken literally and what is meant to be metaphorical. Let's just assume it's internally consistent. When it comes to empirical data, it makes questionable claims such as the sun setting in a pond, and that historical figures literally traveled to the end of the earth. You'll have to decide for yourself if these passages are meant to be literal. Did Muhammad have a sound motive? Review the last slide. Ask yourself, is this the kind of life you'd expect to see from the most important man to ever walk the earth? On preservation, there's just no way to confirm whether or not Uthman's controlled transmission of the message was entirely accurate. As changes to the text have shown, the Book of Mormon was not internally consistent from the beginning. Mormon apologists used to say that scholars agreed there is plenty of evidence for the Book of Mormon. Amidst these claims, National Geographic had to release a public statement saying, quote, "Archaeologists and other scholars have long probed the hemispheres past, and the Society does not know of anything found so far that has substantiated the Book of Mormon." End quote. The LDS Church admits Joseph Smith was arrested for claiming he could find buried treasure by looking into a magic stone. Around the time of his arrest, when he was forced to end this form of income, he happened to write the Book of Mormon also by looking into a magic stone, something that's not known by many members of the church. The church also admits he gained 30 to 40 wives throughout his time as head of the church. The Tipitaka of Buddhism lost major points because of the hundreds of thousands of documents claiming to record Siddhartha, many of which came over 1,000 years after his death. The Bible's harshest critics admitted it is the best attested to book of antiquity, and we've looked at some of the evidence that supports an accurate transmission of key passages from over 40 authors spanning thousands of years. The author of the Quran had some questionable motivations, and there is no way to confirm that a single individual didn't permanently alter the text. Finally, the Book of Mormon falls apart under just about any objective test of history. Don't take my word for it. Many of these resources come from those who personally practice the referenced belief. See what they have to say about the evidence for their very own beliefs.